I still don't know why that picture affected me the way it did, and that uncertainty is what keeps circling back no matter how many times I replay the moment in my head, because it wasn't dramatic or cinematic or anything you'd expect to mark the beginning of something important. It was just another quiet night, the kind where time feels loose and meaningless, where you scroll without intention, simply to fill the empty spaces between thoughts. And I remember my thumb moving almost automatically, muscle memory guiding it past faces and moments that didn't belong to me, until suddenly it stopped, not because I told it to, but because something in me hesitated, as if a part of my mind I don't consciously control had leaned forward and said, "Wait." And there it was, your picture, unassuming, not polished or posed, not asking for attention, yet somehow demanding it in a way I still can't articulate, because at first glance there was nothing extraordinary about it, no obvious reason for my chest to tighten, or for that strange stillness to settle over me. The kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the quiet hum of the room around you, and I remember thinking it was just fatigue, just my mind projecting meaning where there was none. But even as I tried to scroll past, my eyes betrayed me, drifting back to details I hadn't consciously noticed the first time. The way the light fell unevenly, the slight blur that suggested movement, the expression that felt caught between emotions, like you hadn't decided what you were feeling when the photo was taken. And that ambiguity unsettled me more than certainty ever could, because it felt real in a way that staged perfection never does. And suddenly I was aware of a subtle ache, not sharp or painful, just a dull pressure behind my ribs, like a memory trying to surface without knowing which one it wanted to be. And that's when the question started, quiet at first, then insistent, because I found myself wondering who you were in the moments before. And after that picture, what you'd been thinking, whether you were aware of how exposed you looked without meaning to, and it embarrassed me, honestly, to feel that kind of curiosity about a stranger, as if I were crossing some invisible line, reading into something that was never meant for me. So I told myself it was nothing, that people project all the time, that loneliness makes poets out of the board and meaning out of coincidence. Yet, even with all that rational noise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that I had brushed against a thread I wasn't supposed to pull. And the more I stared, the more I felt that familiar internal resistance, the one that shows up when you sense vulnerability either in someone else or in yourself, and you don't know which scares you more, because there was a softness there that didn't feel curated, a tired honesty that reminded me of mirrors I avoid. And I think that's when it hit me that the discomfort wasn't about you at all, not entirely, but about what your image reflected back at me. Parts of myself I keep neatly folded away, parts that remember what it's like to feel something without context or safety. And suddenly the picture wasn't just a picture anymore, it was a pause, a break in the monotony of scrolling where my mind had no distractions left to hide behind. And I became aware of how long it had been since anything made me stop like that. Really stop, not just linger out of habit, but hesitate, as if a decision were being made without my permission. And I remember a strange thought passing through me, fleeting but heavy, the thought that if I had met you under different circumstances, on a train, in a cafe, in a moment where life wasn't mediated by SCR, Eanes, I might have recognized that same feeling, that same quiet pull, and that thought unsettled me even more because it implied a parallel version of events, a world where moments like this aren't reduced to pixels and algorithms. And I wondered how many almosts I've scrolled past without knowing, how many moments of connection dissolve because timing and context never align. And as I sat there, suspended in that reflection, I noticed something else, something subtle but undeniable. I didn't feel excited in the way I associate with attraction. There was no rush, no spark, no cinematic thrill. Instead, there was a calm weight, like when you open a book and realize too late that the story is going to linger with you long after you close it. And that scared me more than infatuation ever could, because infatuation burns fast and clean. But this felt slow, intrusive, like it was settling into corners of my mind I hadn't dusted in years. And I tried to analyze it the way I analyze everything uncomfortable, breaking it down into causes and effects, psychology and projection. But logic kept slipping through my fingers because no explanation accounted for the way my breathing had changed, or why I felt an unexpected urge to look away and look back at the same time. as if seeing you too clearly might reveal something I wasn't ready to confront. And in that tension between curiosity and restraint, I realized how practiced I'd become at emotional distance, how easy it is to consume people as content without ever letting them touch you, and yet here I was, affected by a single image, by someone who didn't know I existed, and that imbalance made me feel exposed, almost foolish. Because what does it say about me that a moment so small could feel so significant, that I could be shaken by a fragment of someone else's life? And maybe that's why I'm still thinking about it now. Replay. Ing it, dissecting it, not because of who you are, but because of what that pause revealed about me, that beneath the routines and the practiced indifference, there's still a part of me capable of being interrupted, of being moved without explanation, and as I finally did scroll past, forcing motion back into my thumb, I felt a quiet resistance, not regret exactly, but a lingering awareness, like the echo of a sound you didn't realize had mattered until it faded, and I knew, even then, that this wasn't over, that the picture would return uninvited in quieter moments, not as an image, but as a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered, because sometimes the most unsettling thing isn't knowing why something affects you, but realizing that it does it all. I told myself I'd forgotten about the picture, and for a while that lie almost held, slipping neatly into the rhythm of days filled with obligations and noise, the kind of days where you move from one task to another without ever fully arriving in any of them, and yet the image lingered in a way that didn't feel visual anymore but atmospheric, like a change in pressure you only notice when your ears start to ring, because it wasn't your face I remembered, so much as the feeling that had settled into me afterward, that quiet unease paired with an unfamiliar alertness, as if something had been set in motion without my consent, and I found myself thinking about it at odd times, not when I was actively searching for distraction, but in the pauses, in the seconds before sleep when the mind loosens its grip, in the space between songs when the world feels briefly unscored, in those moments when you catch your reflection in a window and don't immediately recognize the person staring back, and each time it surfaced, I felt the same resistance, that reflexive urge to dismiss it as coincidence, as boredom, as projection, because Akien. Acknowledging it felt like opening a door I'd spent years reinforcing. And the more I resisted, the clearer it became that what unsettled me wasn't attraction, but recognition, a sense of familiarity that made no logical sense. Because I didn't know you, I hadn't lived your life or shared your experiences, and yet there was something about the way you existed in that captured moment that felt aligned with a part of me I rarely acknowledge. And that alignment felt dangerous, not because it promised something dramatic, but because it suggested a depth I wasn't sure I had the capacity to engage with anymore, and I began to question when exactly I'd become so cautious, when openness had turned into something I rationed carefully, like a resource I couldn't afford to waste. And as these thoughts circled, I noticed how often I returned to the same conclusion, that it would have been easier if the picture had been obviously beautiful or clearly compelling, because then I could have labeled my reaction and moved on, filed it under desire or admiration. But it wasn't like that. It was subtle, understated, almost quiet. And that quietness mirrored my own inner landscape more than I was comfortable admitting, because I've always trusted loud emotions more than soft ones. Always believed that if something mattered, it would announce itself clearly. And yet, here was proof that some things arrive gently and still manage to rearrange you. And I wondered how many of those I'd dismissed over the years because they didn't fit my expectations of impact. And that line of thinking led me somewhere more uncomfortable, to the realization that I've spent a long time protecting myself from exactly this kind of interruption, from moments that don't demand attention but earn it, because those are the ones that slip past defenses. And as I sat with that awareness, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and clarity, like seeing a familiar room in different lighting, and I began to understand that my reaction wasn't about you specifically, but about timing, about the quiet readiness I hadn't known I carried. Because had I seen that picture months earlier, or years, it might have passed unnoticed, just another face in the endless stream. But now, in this particular moment of my life, it landed differently, intersecting with unspoken questions I'd been avoiding, about connection and isolation, about whether I'd grown comfortable being untouched or simply resigned to it. And those questions followed me through the day, not loudly, not insistently, but persistently, like a low-frequency hum I couldn't tune out. And I caught myself observing people more closely, noticing expressions and gestures with a curiosity that felt newly sharpened, as if that single pause had recalibrated my attention. And with that came an unsettling awareness of how disconnected most interactions feel, how often we skim the surface of each other, exchanging information without presence. And I realized that what struck me about your picture was the absence of performance. The sense that you weren't trying to be seen in any particular way, and that authenticity, accidental or not, felt rare, especially in a world that rewards careful curation. And I wondered if that was what I'd been missing, not you, but the feeling of encountering something unfiltered, something that didn't ask me to respond a certain way. And that thought brought with it a quiet sadness, because it implied a hunger I hadn't acknowledged, a longing not for romance or drama, but for resonance, for moments that feel honest enough to linger. And as the days passed, I noticed how my initial confusion softened into something more reflective, less urgent but deeper, like sediment settling at the bottom of water. And I stopped trying to force an explanation, allowing the question to exist without an answer. And in that acceptance, I found myself confronting a subtle fear that if a single image could affect me this way, then maybe I'm not as guarded as I pretend. Maybe the walls I rely on are thinner than I'd like to believe. And that realization was both unsettling and strangely reassuring, because it suggested that despite everything, despite the distance I've cultivated, I'm still capable of being moved in quiet, unremarkable moments. And as much as I tried to downplay that fact, I couldn't deny the shift it caused, the way it made me more aware of my own interiority, more attentive to the small signals I usually ignore. And by the time I admitted to myself that the picture had changed something, however subtly, it no longer felt like a disruption but like a mirror, reflecting not who you were, but who I still might be if I allow myself to notice. By the time I accepted that the picture had settled into me rather than passing through, I stopped thinking of it as an isolated moment and started seeing it as a marker, a quiet before and after that didn't announce itself with drama, but altered the texture of my days in small, accumulating ways, because I noticed how often my mind returned not to the image itself, but to the space it had opened, that reflective gap where questions surfaced without answers. And in that space, I began to sense how much of my life I've been living on autopilot, moving efficiently, competently, but without the kind of presence that allows things to truly register. And this realization didn't arrive with guilt so much as a dull ache, the kind you feel when you recognize a truth you can't immediately act on. Because awareness doesn't always come with solutions. Sometimes it just sits there, heavy and patient, and I found myself wondering when I'd last allowed something unfamiliar to affect me without immediately categorizing it, when I'd last trusted an instinct that didn't come with justification. And the more I traced that question back, the more I saw a pattern of restraint, a habit of minimizing reactions, of translating feeling into analysis before it had a chance to breathe. And it became clear that my response to your picture had slipped past that habit precisely because it didn't trigger any of my usual narratives. It wasn't obviously hopeful or dangerous or nostalgic. It was ambiguous, and ambiguity has a way of disarming defenses. And once I noticed that, I began to recognize how uncomfortable ambiguity makes me, how quickly I try to resolve it into certainty, even when that certainty is limiting. And this recognition extended beyond that moment into my relationships, my choices, the way I navigate uncertainty by narrowing possibilities rather than expanding them. And I realized that the unease I felt wasn't about being affected, but about not knowing what that effect meant. Because we're taught to measure experiences by outcomes, to ask what comes next, what does this lead to? And here was something that resisted progression, something that existed purely as an internal shift, and that felt almost irresponsible in a world obsessed with momentum, and yet I couldn't dismiss it because it had already altered my attention, my sensitivity to small things, and I began to see how rarely I allow myself to linger in those in-between states, how often I rush toward clarity, as if it's the only form of safety. And as I sat with that, I felt a quiet grief for all the moments I might have hurried past, moments that didn't promise anything tangible but could have deepened my understanding of myself. And this grief wasn't dramatic, it was subtle and ongoing, like a background noise you only notice when the room falls silent. And it made me think about how we define significance, how we assume that impact must be visible or shared to be real, and yet this experience, private and unremarkable from the outside, had reshaped my inner landscape more than many events I could easily point to, and I began to accept that some shifts don't announce themselves because they're not meant to be witnessed. They meant to be lived with, and That acceptance softened something in me, loosening my need to explain, to justify, to translate everything into something legible. And in that softened state, I noticed how my thoughts about you changed, becoming less about curiosity and more about appreciation, not for who you might be, but for the role your unintentional presence played in this unraveling. And I stopped wondering whether I should look for you again or recreate that moment because I understood that repetition would miss the point, that the power of the experience came from its singularity, from the fact that it caught me unprepared. And this understanding brought with it a strange sense of closure paired with openness, like finishing a sentence you didn't realize you'd been forming while leaving the conversation unfinished, and I felt less compelled to resolve the feeling and more willing to let it inform me quietly, to let it influence how I move through the world without needing to be named. And as days turned into weeks, I noticed how that initial pause had recalibrated my sense of time, making me more attentive to moments that resist easy interpretation, moments that demand reaction but invite presence. And I found myself staying longer in conversations, listening without planning responses, noticing the way light shifts in a room, the way emotions flicker across faces before they're masked, and in these small acts of attention, I felt a subtle reclaiming of something I hadn't known I'd lost a capacity for, being affected without being overwhelmed, and I realized that this was the real change, not the lingering thought of a picture, but the way it reminded me that I'm still porous, still responsive, still capable of being moved by things that don't fit neatly into narratives. And that realization, while quiet, felt significant enough to hold, not as a story to tell, but as a way of being to practice, a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful shifts begin without explanation and continue without resolution, altering us not by force, but by invitation. Surprised me most as time went on wasn't that the memory of the picture remained, but that it gradually lost its sharpness while its influence deepened, as if the image itself were dissolving, but the imprint it left continued to expand, threading its way into places I hadn't anticipated, because I realized I was no longer measuring moments by how productive or entertaining they were, but by how present I felt inside them. And that shift, subtle as it was, began to challenge the structures I'd built my life around, the quiet agreements I'd made with myself about what mattered and what didn't, and I started noticing how often I'd been choosing efficiency over depth, clarity over curiosity, control over openness, not out of necessity but habit. And this awareness didn't arrive with condemnation. It arrived with tenderness, with a recognition that those choices had once protected me, had helped me navigate periods when staying open would have been too costly, and yet here I was, in a different season, still living by rules written for an earlier version of myself, and the picture had acted like a gentle interruption, not demanding change but revealing readiness, and as I sat with that realization, I felt an unfamiliar compassion toward my own guardedness, an understanding that defenses don't disappear when they're no longer needed. They have to be thanked and gradually laid down, and this compassion softened the way I related to my past, allowing me to see the distance I'd cultivated not as failure but as adaptation. And with that reframing came a quiet permission to experiment with closeness again, not dramatically, not all at once, but in measured, almost imperceptible ways, like allowing myself to feel the weight of silence in a conversation without rushing to fill it, or admitting uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. And these small experiments revealed how much richness exists in the spaces we usually hurry through, and I began to sense that what the picture had offered me wasn't longing for another person, but an invitation back into my own interior life. A reminder that attention itself is a form of intimacy, and this realization changed the way I thought about connection, shifting it from something that happens between people to something that begins within. And as that understanding took root, I noticed how my expectations softened, how I stopped scanning interactions for outcomes and started engaging them for their own sake. And this shift brought with it a quiet relief, the release of a pressure I hadn't known I was carrying, the pressure to make every experience mean something tangible, something that could be explained or shared. And instead, I allowed meaning to be provisional, to exist without proof, and in doing so, I felt more grounded, more at ease with not knowing where things were going, and this ease extended to my thoughts about you, which had by now transformed into something less specific and more symbolic. less about a person and more about a threshold I'd crossed without noticing. And I understood that your role in this was complete, not because it was insignificant, but because it had served its purpose, like a book you return to the shelf after it's changed the way you think. And this understanding didn't feel like loss, it felt like integration, like the moment when an insight stops feeling new and starts feeling true. And as I reflected on that, I became aware of how rarely we allow experiences to end cleanly, without clinging or dismissal, and I felt a quiet gratitude for the way this one had unfolded, unforced and unclaimed, leaving me with something I could carry forward without needing to revisit its origin. And this gratitude wasn't directed outward, it was inward, toward my own capacity to notice, to pause, to be affected without demanding explanation. And in that gratitude, I sensed a renewed trust in myself, a belief that I could navigate openness without losing stability, that I could let moments touch me without unraveling, and this trust subtly reshaped my sense of agency, making me feel less reactive and more responsive, less guarded and more discerning. And as days continued to layer themselves one over another, I found that the initial question, why that picture affected me, no longer felt urgent, because I understood that the value of the experience didn't lie in its cause, but in its consequence, in the way it had reoriented me toward presence, toward gentler attention, toward a life that allows for interruption. And this understanding settled into me quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a practice, something to return to when I feel myself slipping back into numb efficiency, a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful shifts arrive without explanation, and ask only that we notice what they make possible. Now, when I think back to that moment, it feels less like a beginning or an ending, and more like a hinge, a subtle point of movement that didn't announce itself as significant until I noticed how differently things opened afterward. Because the question that once preoccupied me, why that picture affected me, has slowly loosened its grip, replaced by a quieter, more sustaining awareness of what it gave me permission to feel. And that permission has become the most lasting part of the experience, shaping the way I inhabit my days with a gentler attention, a willingness to be present, without immediately translating experience into meaning. And I've come to understand that the picture mattered not because of who you were or what could have, but because it arrived at a moment when I was ready to be interrupted, ready to be reminded. Depth doesn't require drama, that connection doesn't always need reciprocity to be real, and that being moved, even briefly, is not a weakness but a sign of aliveness. And this understanding has subtly changed the way I relate to my own inner life, making me less suspicious of quiet feelings and more trusting of experiences that resist easy explanation. And I've noticed how this trust has created space for a different kind of clarity, one that doesn't rush to define or categorize, but allows things to unfold at their own pace. And in that space, I've felt renewed sense of integrity, a feeling that my inner and outer lives are more aligned, less at odds with one another, because I'm no longer dismissing moments simply because they don't fit a narrative I can articulate. And this alignment has brought with it a calm confidence, not the loud kind that seeks validation, but a steady assurance that I can navigate uncertainty without losing myself. And when I occasionally recall the image now, it appears less as a face and more as a feeling, a reminder of the moment I noticed myself noticing, the instant when attention turned inward and revealed a capacity I hadn't fully trusted, and that capacity, to pause, to feel, to remain open without demand, has become something I carry forward consciously, shaping how I engage with the world and the people in it. And I find that I'm more patient with ambiguity, more tolerant of unfinished stories, including my own. And this patience has softened my expectations, allowing me to meet experiences where they are rather than where I think they should lead. And in doing so, I've discovered a quiet richness that had been available all along, but required a different kind of listening to perceive. And I think that's what ultimately resolved the question for me. Not an answer in the traditional sense, but a shift in perspective made the quiz shine less relevant, because the value of that moment was never in understanding it completely, but in allowing it to change how I understand myself. And as I move forward, I don't feel the need to seek out similar moments or recreate that pause, because I've learned that they can't be manufactured, only received, and that knowledge has made me more attentive, more receptive, not in a searching way, but in a grounded one, trusting that when something is meant to interrupt me, I'll recognize it, not because it will be loud or obvious, but because it will ask me to stop, to feel, and to stay, if only for a moment, and in that staying, I found a deeper sense of continuity, a feeling that even fleeting experiences can leave enduring traces, not as stories to be retold, but as shifts in how we move through the world. And so, when I finally let the memory rest, it does so gently, without resistance or regret, integrated into the quiet fabric of my life, as a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful things don't ask to be understood, they ask only to be noticed. And in noticing them, we find ourselves changed in ways that don't need explanation to be real.